Coming up on this Friday edition of Newsline at Noon, a group of nearly 20 U.S. historians slam the Abe administration for attempting to censor Japan's wartime atrocities, including its sexual enslavement of tens of thousands of women. U.S. lawmakers introduced bipartisan legislation to toughen sanctions against North Korea. They want to starve the regime of cash by imposing harsh penalties on companies doing business with the North. Plus, the leaders of Germany and France fly to Kiev to propose a new peace initiative to end the Ukraine crisis. The two leaders travel to Moscow today. These stories and more on Newsline at Noon.
It's noon Friday, February 6th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broome. We start with a rare expression of discontent by a group of US-based historians to the Japanese government's attempts to whitewash history.
The scholars are protesting against the Abe administration's push to censor Japan's past atrocities, especially on the issue of its wartime system of sexual slavery, which so terribly affected tens of thousands of Korean women. Connie Lee has the story.
This is a joint statement scheduled to appear in the March edition of the official periodical of the American Historical Association. A copy of the statement, which was sent to Seoul-based Yonhap news agency, shows 19 American history scholars expressing strong protest against Japan's attempts to suppress statements or water down atrocities in history textbooks, not only in Japan but also elsewhere in the world. The statement is in response to Japan's efforts earlier this month to pressure U.S. publisher McGraw-Hill to change how it describes its wartime sexual slavery issue in one of its history textbooks shown here. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe claims there are errors in the history book taught in classrooms, with his administration continuing to deny state responsibility for the country's past atrocities. The group of scholars, led by Professor Alex Dutton from the University of Connecticut, say that no government should have the right to censor history, and they accuse the Abe administration of questioning established history and attempting to eliminate references about the country's sexual enslavement of women during World War II. Historians estimate up to 200,000 women, mostly from Korea, were forced to work in brothels for the Japanese military. As a collective statement on a specific historical issue is seen as highly unusual, analysts are now watching how this will affect Abe's relations with the U.S. and his upcoming visit to Washington sometime this spring. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
U.S. lawmakers have introduced new legislation to toughen sanctions against North Korea. The new bill aims to expand its sanctions, allowing Washington to freeze the U.S.-based assets of third-nation companies and individuals with links to Pyongyang. Connie Kim reports.
U.S. lawmakers are pushing to broaden sanctions on North Korea in the wake of Pyongyang's alleged hack attack on Sony Pictures. U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce said Thursday, a new piece of bipartisan legislation aims to prevent North Korea from accessing the hard currency that supports the regime. The bill would allow U.S. officials to freeze assets held in the U.S. of individuals or international companies found to be doing business with the North or who have links to the regime's nuclear program. Those who contributed to the massive cyber attack on Sony Pictures last November would also be targeted. The legislation broadens current sanctions on the North, which are focused on U.S. companies and Americans. A similar bill was passed by the House last year and received in the Senate, but was later scrapped. The bill's passage is more likely this time as the U.S. has vowed to clamp down on Pyongyang in light of the cyber attack on the Hollywood-based studio. The Senate is also expected to introduce a similar bill. Last month, U.S. President Barack Obama signed an executive order that imposes sanctions against 3 North Korean organizations and 10 individuals. It was the first time the U.S. had sanctioned any country for a cyber attack and implied more sanctions could be on the way, as the U.S. said at the time it was just the first aspect of the U.S. response. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Now, there's growing speculation China has and continues to support North Korea's cyber warfare operations. In an article posted online on the U.S.-based conservative magazine Weekly Standard, Dennis Halpin, a visiting scholar at the U.S.-Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins, suggests Beijing's computer experts even helped North Korea hack Sony Pictures last November. He said Pyongyang's cyber warfare agency Bureau 121 is based at a hotel in northeast China close to the border, and North Korea's nearly 2,000-member elite cyber hacking team are actually trained in China. The scholar adds that it seems highly unlikely a major North Korean intelligence operation exists in China without China's knowledge and approval. North Korea's total grain production last year reached its highest level since the beginning of the regime's economic collapse in the mid-1990s. According to the United Nations World Food Program and Food and Agriculture Organization, North Korea's total grain production, which includes rice, corn, and beans, amounted to nearly 5 million tons in 2014. That's 130,000 tons more than its total production the year before. Data shows that the regime's food production has been gradually increasing ever since Kim Jong-un came into power in 2011. However, North Korea is still short on the grain needed to maintain the bare minimum necessary for its people due to decreased international aid and losses in productivity from floods and famine. Now, would you invest in North Korea? The first thing that comes to mind when thinking about North Korea is its unpredictability. Well, as the regime seeks much-needed foreign investment, some adventurous businessmen have identified some opportunities. Arirang News' Hwang Seung-hee takes a look at how the world's most closed economy is trying to make money.
Its constant military provocations, threats and dangerous brinkmanship over its nuclear program make North Korea the least attractive place for business. But some say the regime is opening up to draw much-needed foreign investment, for example, in tourism.
There is now a growing trade in tourism from the Netherlands to North Korea. So the North Korean government is now inviting Dutch students to go to Pyongyang to give Dutch language training to the North Korean tour guides.
Around 100,000 tourists visit this untrodden corner of the world every year, and North Korea says it aims to raise that number to 1 million. For that, it has set up opulent new ventures like the Masikryang ski resort. Korea Tours, a Western travel agency that organizes trips to the north, says the regime is enthusiastic about its program proposals most of the time.
A lot of projects that we've been working on that have become possible in the last 3 years or so are things we were working on beforehand.
But North Korea's unpredictability is troubling. The regime banned tourists last October on Ebola fears, with no signs of lifting it anytime soon. In fact, North Korea was placed at the very bottom of the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, with a score of 1.3 points out of 100. That's over 70 points behind South Korea and nearly 30 points below Cuba, which came second to last on the list.
So it doesn't provide any meaningful consistency in terms of policy. And also North Korea remains, many factors in North Korea are unknown. So I think that's the key risky factor for the investors.
Experts say North Korea's handling of the inter-Korean Kaesong industrial complex, with its frequent changes in regulations and unilateral shutdowns, is a good example of its uncertainty. Despite the problem, trade between the two countries hit a record $2.3 billion last year, thanks to growing output in the joint business park. Given the lack of resources and capital, experts say Pyongyang must open up and reform its antiquated economic system.
That's the only way to improve the daily lives of North Koreans.
But first, North Korea will have to end its confrontation with the outside world over its nuclear program. Hwang Seung-hee, Arirang News.
South Korea has reaffirmed that the United States has not made any official request to deploy its advanced defense missile battery known as THAAD to the Korean Peninsula. The system is designed to shoot down short, medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles at a higher altitude in their terminal phase are using a so-called hit-to-kill method. Seoul's foreign ministry said on Thursday that absolutely no consultations have taken place thus far, at least. The ministry also stressed that U.S. officials, including outgoing Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel and the top U.S. envoy to Seoul, Mark Lippert, confirmed Washington is undecided on whether to pursue the issue in the South. China and Russia say the deployment of THAAD to South Korea would pose a threat to their national security. Critics in South Korea say it's Washington's attempt to get Seoul to join its broader air shield system, which will likely spark tensions in the region. The clock is ticking for the South Korean military to replace its aging fleet of fighter jets that have already reached or even surpassed their lifespan. In an effort to ensure the transition period is as smooth as possible, the country is kickstarting a new multi-billion-dollar project to develop its own homegrown jets. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
The Korea fighter jet program aims to develop 4.5 generation fighter jets to fill in the gap with more advanced technology, as a batch of Korean fighters are set to be retired in the coming years.
South Korea's Air Force has around 400 jets in service, but roughly half of them are antiquated jets, such as the F-4 and F-5. These days, 4th and 5th generation fighters are the mainstay globally, but Korea is lagging behind with mostly 3rd generation jets.
Korea has set aside roughly $17 billion for a project to develop and mass-produce 124.5 generation fighter jets that will replace the Air Force's old F-4s and F-5s. The KF-X jets are scheduled to be integrated into the Air Force in 2025. On top of that, Korea recently signed a roughly $7 billion deal with Lockheed Martin for 45th generation F-35 stealth fighters, though there are some concerns. Some experts worry that a delay could push Korea's already old fighter jet fleet to the limit. South Korea's defense ministry says it's looking into other options, such as enhancing the performance of the current KF-16 fleet and tanker aircraft to fill in temporarily. The KF-X, however, will not be Korea's first homegrown fighter jet. The F-A-50, which finished development in 2011, was integrated into the Air Force last October. That jet has already caught the eye of international buyers. Korea has exported more than 50 of them to Iraq, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Seoul also plans to sell 24 F-A-50s to Peru this year in a deal worth some $2 billion. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
Jordan backed up its promise for revenge on the Islamic State militant group on Thursday, launching wave after wave of bombing raids on some of the militant group's key positions in northern Syria. The small Arab nation, still reeling from the brutal murder of one of its pilots, says there is much more to come. Kwon Swa reports.
This is just the beginning, is what Jordan's military vowed after launching its first airstrikes against Islamic State since the extremists released a video this week showing Jordanian pilot Muath al-Qasasbeh being burned alive in a cage. Jordan's army expressed its will on state television to take revenge on the militant group, showing footage of dozens of warplanes bombing what appeared to be munitions bases and training camps in northern Syria.
Tens of Royal Jordanian Air Force aircraft launched consecutive airstrikes to demolish strongholds and holes of the terror organization Islamic State.
Iraqi media reports more than 50 IS militants were killed, including a senior commander. After the raid, the fighter jets flew over the hometown of the deceased pilot as Jordan's King Abdullah was visiting the pilot's grieving family. Qasasbeh's father, a key member of a powerful tribe in Jordan, reportedly said he got King Abdullah's word that his son's death would be avenged. On the day the gruesome execution video was released, he said the Jordanian government must take action. Jordan has already shown its fury by executing 2 Iraqi militants connected with IS, including the woman the militant group originally demanded in exchange for releasing Qasasbeh. Jordan's airstrikes were the first since the pilot's capture in December brought them to a halt. Jordan is part of the U.S.-led coalition against Islamic State, but there's still a political divide within the country as to how much Jordan should be involved in this fight. Kwon-soa, Arirang News.
Korea's finance minister has waded into the tax versus welfare debate that's heated up on the political front. Choi Kyung-wan says he is against raising taxes at the moment as he believes the extra strain on people's pocketbooks would exacerbate deflationary pressure on the economy. Hwang Jie reports.
Now is not the time to talk about a tax hike. That's what Korean Finance Minister Choi Kyung-wan said on Thursday at the National Assembly. He said raising taxes will lead to shrinking domestic demand under the current economic conditions, stoking concerns over deflation risks. Choi added, however, that if a tax increase was to happen, it could only be through public consensus. The minister is sticking with President Park Geun-hye's campaign pledge to provide more welfare while keeping tax revenues fixed. And to do so, the government pledged Thursday to make its financial structure more efficient by cutting out overlapping welfare programs and raising transparency in local finances. The finance ministry said it will first merge or discard 600 redundant welfare programs. The move to streamline finances looks inevitable as Korea is expected to post a tax deficit for the fourth straight year in 2015. This amid calls for broader welfare in a country that has one of the fastest aging population with low birth rates. The finance ministry estimates last year's revenue shortfall will stand at over 11 trillion won or roughly $10 billion. Hwang Jie, Arirang News.
The chairman of Hyundai Motor Group and his son have sold around 13% of their stake in the group's logistics arm to avoid a new regulation on intra-group transactions. Now, analysts speculate the move is to raise cash for the son and heir apparent to purchase shares in key units to solidify control over the automotive company. Kim Min-ji reports.
The chairman and vice chairman of Hyundai Motor Group have offloaded some of their stakes in the group's logistics affiliate, landing them some $1 billion in cash. Chairman Jung Mong-gu and his only son and deputy, Eoh Jin-joo, sold over 5 million shares in Hyundai Glovis, or 13.4% of equity in a block deal, according to industry officials on Friday. The price per share stood at around $210, 2.7% lower than the previous day's close. It's also down about $45 from what the family initially offered at their first attempt last month, which failed due to disagreement over sales terms. The sale comes as Hyundai Glovis has to meet a revised antitrust law on intergroup transactions. The law, which takes effect this month, calls for up to 3 years in jail for controlling shareholders owning a stake of 30% or more if they carry out intergroup transactions that benefit them. Now, with the stock sales sealed, the combined stakes held by the chairman and his son dropped to 29.99%. Analysts also see the move as an attempt to raise cash for the son and heir apparent, needed to increase his control in the automotive group by purchasing shares in key units. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, foreigners coming to Korea for medical services are spending less than they used to. The Bank of Korea says spending by foreign patients visiting Korea for medical services dropped by $25 million. That's around 6.5% last year from the year before. It's the first decline since the central bank began collating related data in 2006. And this is raising concerns that Korea's medical tourism industry is actually slowing down. The drop in spending is attributed to a weaker Russian ruble that's kept Russian patients from coming over here for various treatments. However, the medical community in Korea is optimistic that the spending will pick up as the number of foreign patients from the Middle East is actually growing. Russia's inflation rate hit its highest level in 16 years last month due to a slide in the value of the ruble. According to Russia's State Statistics Service, January's inflation rate amounted to 3.9% compared to 2.6% a month before. This is the highest pace of inflation in Russia since February 1999, when consumer prices grew by 4.1% in just a solitary month. January's rate was also considerably higher than the state statistic agency's forecast of 2.7% and economists' outlook of 2.6%. The figures come just days after the country's central bank cut its main interest rate from 17% to 15%, citing stabilizing inflation. Time now for a look through the rest of the global headlines we're following this Friday lunchtime from Seoul. For that, we turn to Eunice Kim, standing by at the News Center.
Eunice, world leaders are rushing to find a diplomatic resolution to the Ukraine crisis as Washington continues to mull over sending weapons to Kiev.
Yeah, that's right, Jin-joo. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President François Hollande made a surprise trip to Kiev with a peace proposal in hand, a plan they intend to take to Moscow later on this Friday as well. This as peace talks broke down with no progress over the weekend. Our Son Jung-in has more.
The leaders of Germany and France have proposed a new peace initiative for Ukraine, raising hopes of a breakthrough in the year-old conflict pitting Kiev against separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. Angela Merkel and François Hollande said they have worked together to draft a proposal based on Ukraine's territorial integrity and hope it will be acceptable to both sides in the conflict. The high-level diplomatic maneuver is seen as an apparent bid to head off U.S. consideration of lethal military aid for the Ukrainian government in its war against the Russian-backed separatists. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, who had arrived in Kiev earlier, met with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko and other top officials to affirm U.S. support for a diplomatic resolution to the conflict. Kerry also urged Moscow to show its commitment to a peaceful solution and to cease its military support for the separatists, an allegation that Russia strongly denies. Fierce fighting has flared again in the region in recent weeks, with rebels advancing on a railway hub held by Ukrainian troops after launching an offensive that scuppered a 5-month-old ceasefire. According to the United Nations, the fighting has claimed more than 5,000 lives since April last year, including some 220 civilians killed in just the past 3 weeks. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
And an early showdown. The finance ministers of Greece and Germany were not shy about showing their differences on the viability of Athens' new plan to scrap austerity. Following talks in Berlin, German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble urged the Alexis Tsipras administration to return to arrangements reached with the EU, saying it was not realistic to make electoral promises that burdened other countries. His Greek counterpart, Yanis Varoufakis, said the two had not even agreed to disagree, indicating that his government remained resolute on its path. Meanwhile, back in Athens, thousands of anti-austerity protesters filled Syntagma Square Thursday, saying Greece would not be blackmailed. The ECB had recently decided to reject Greek bonds as collateral for future emergency funds. And finally, hope has thinned in Taiwan, where divers resumed their search for the 11 missing passengers aboard TransAsia Flight 235. Less than 2 days after Wednesday's crash, emergency crews cleared the site of impact. Salvaged wreckage, including the fuselage, was transported to Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council for further investigation. Today, a team of 60 divers and 20 boats returned to Keelung River to search for those still unaccounted for. Meanwhile, the pilot of Flight 235 is being hailed as a hero for steering the aircraft away from apartment blocks and commercial buildings in those final moments, averting even heavier casualties. Local media said the 42-year-old was found in the plane's cockpit, still clutching the joystick. Analysis of the recovered black boxes is expected soon.
The cold morning we had is shaping up to be a fairly nice day. The highs will be similar to yesterday, hovering at above 5 degrees for the upper provinces and near 10 degrees down south. But beware of a big temperature gaps between lows and highs and take good care of yourself to avoid catching a cold. Now we'll have sunny skies throughout the day and the levels of fine dust have come back down to normal here in the capital, making a great day to be outdoors this afternoon. So with that, let's take a closer look at the readings for today. The high in Seoul will climb up to 6, while Daegu and Gwangju peak at 8, and Busan will top out at 10 this afternoon. And as for the other regions, Jeju Island and Daejeon will see a high of 9 and 7, and Dokdo peaks at 6. Now brace yourself for a bitterly cold Sunday as the low plunges to -11, and the high will only rise to -5, and that means we'll kick off next week under icy cold conditions. That's all for me at this hour. Back to you, Mark and Jin-joo.
Thank you, Jian, for the weather update. And this is where we say goodbye on this Friday afternoon.
Yes, it is. Thank you ever so much for watching and have a great weekend.